Guess I just
Uh, yeah, my name is Becky Rosenow. I've been in biotech for the last 10 years in medical devices, diagnostics, therapeutics. And I think with any industry, if you've been there long enough, you're going to develop some pet peeves, right? So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I am going to talk about not just one of my pet peeves, but the way that I have found that's a really effective tool for getting around it. So people talk a lot about design thinking, where you have a problem and then you design to solve it, and that is great. And obviously, that's necessary because, as we all know in biotech, there's a tendency to develop shiny solutions that may or may not actually deliver value to people. But I'm going to be talking about systems thinking in terms of how it can really make your product development more effective. So a lot of you might be familiar with systems thinking, which, if you are in the software world or the tech world, it's essentially understanding a system. Nothing happens in a vacuum. There are relationships, patterns, and interdependencies throughout like a process or a product. So, what is the big picture? How do these different things interact with each other? And then recognizing that if you make changes in one area, it will impact the others. So, the example that I really want to kind of talk through is one that is near and dear to my heart. Liquid biopsy, in vitro diagnostic development. This is an area where I've spent a lot of time. And there's a disconnect between research and product development. So while both are necessary components to an R&D organization, the research workflow is mostly about trying to get proof of concept, figuring out if you have the technology to make it work. So in this example, you've got a plasma sample, you are extracting analytes, analyzing them, and reporting them. Your focus is on optimizing those proprietary elements, getting the IP, intellectual property generated, and making essentially the best performance that you can. However, when you're thinking about how to translate that research into a product and how to develop that product, you need to think more broadly. So, all the way from how does this test get ordered? So, who is ordering it? You can extrapolate even farther, right? Who is ordering the test? Who is our customer? How do we get them to order it? So, you have sort of this market development aspect. And then the logistics of the test ordering. How are they going to do it? Is it part of their electronic menu? Um, Whole blood collection. Are you using specific tubes? I know if you're working with cell-free DNA, a lot of people want to use like PAX gene or Strec tubes to um, to get those tiny nucleic acid fragments. So are those going to be processed on site? Are they going to be shipped? We all know you can't just ship blood in the mail. And if you didn't know that, you do know now. A surprising number of people are not aware that you can't just ship blood in the mail. And then how does it get processed to plasma? How do you extract the analytes? And this is all a little more in product development. You still have this small system, right, of the plasma to analysis and reporting. However, rather than performance so much, you're more focused on like robustness. So, how long can the plasma sit out at room temperature if it's been previously frozen? Can you refreeze it? How many times can it go through a freeze thaw before you're no longer getting valid results? These are questions that you need to have answered in order to have like a robust understanding of your workflow. And then, reporting. Here's a big one: the clinically relevant impact. So, okay, what are you going to do with this data? If anyone's been following, the dramatic saga that is Grail, not only are there regulatory issues with that acquisition from Illumina, but also what does that test? What does the Galeri 360 test? What does it do? It's a multi-cancer early detection test. Great. What do doctors do with that information? So understanding that is also part of your product, right? What does this do? How does it impact patient care? Because FDA is going to ask that, right? If what happens if you have a false positive? What happens if you have a false negative? What goes on after you get a result from here? And then, how does it get paid for? Is it something that people are paying for out of pocket? Are you going through a payer? And then in this case, in vitro diagnostic, you need patient outcome monitoring. You need to have a quality management system. So your product is out there in the world, people are using it. They need to have a way to like lodge complaints. You need to be able to track performance. And then there are obviously other aspects to a compliant quality management system as well. But when it comes to considering, okay, how do we develop this product? It no longer is just about how do we get from plasma sample to a positive or negative for cancer. It becomes you have to consider the entire product as a whole. So one example of it may or may not have been this exact system or similar to it, working in product development, we were having issues with sensitivity, which is not uncommon, right? There's not a whole lot of cell-free DNA if that's what you're looking for. And if you're looking for specific biomarkers, that can narrow down your focus even more. So we're having trouble getting this to be as sensitive as we need it to be. And the research answer is we'll just double the plasma input, just put more plasma into your extraction. Sure, we can do that. But then there's the question of, okay, well, where do we get double the plasma? Are patients going to be willing to give double the plasma? Were we already going to be able to collect the volume that we needed from one tube, or were we already going to need two? What is the actual volume of plasma that we get from each blood tube? In a 10 mil draw, is it 4 mils? Is it 3.5 mils? What is it? So these questions that might seem very simple in a research setting become more complicated with the product development lens, but they're also critical because this is where you go from having solid science to actually having something that can be purchased, something you can get paid for, something you can scale, something that can deliver value to patients as a product. So I think that if I'm counting correctly, I think that's about my time. Does anyone have questions?
Thanks, Becky.
Do you find that like groups that have like a translational science team do a little better, or can you tell?
It depends on their translational science team. So I once brought up the systems thinking approach at the beginning of product development to somebody I was working with because they were having issues where things look very promising in like the pure research stages, and then in product development, they just didn't look quite as good, and they couldn't really figure out why. Part of it was because the research director was cherry picking the samples that they were using in order to show proof of concept data to the CEO. But the other part of it was that they weren't considering all of these pieces. So when I brought up that, hey, you really need to consider the entire workflow as a whole and point out these weak points and the areas that are going to need development that you're not thinking about. Things like how do you integrate with the laboratory information management system? How do you integrate with LIMS in a compliant fashion if you are running things in a CAP CLIA lab? These types of things just sort of like would pop up at go to market, and you can't really afford to be delayed at that step when you've already spoken to your investors and your cranky stakeholders, and they already have these expectations. So it really depends on the translational science group and whether they're able to kind of zoom out and zoom in rapidly in order to like, all right, this is something that we are aware of, and then they like dig in and fix it. The in my experience, the ones with more industry experience versus coming straight from academia tend to be a little bit more successful in this because they've gotten bitten by it enough times.
Cool. We'll take one more question if anybody has one. Feel free to come off mute or raise your hand and I can call you out. Yeah. I'm a deep.
Thanks. Great points, Becky, there. Thank you so much for sharing the flow. Just fundamentally, looking at any product design in any area of life sciences, what would you say would be the best practices to keep in mind when just beginning out there as a founder or as somebody who's going to build a new product?
Yeah, so I know I said I was focusing on systems thinking rather than design thinking, but the design thinking really needs to be at the forefront so that you can ensure you're developing the right solution and it's something that people actually need. So it's pretty common for people to get really excited about this technology that they've developed or this new shiny object, but the utility of it is a little harder to grasp. So things like I'll use the Galleri 360 test again. It's really cool, obviously, right? And patients might all want one, but patients aren't necessarily the ones who are ordering them, it's physicians. And if physicians don't feel that there are clinically meaningful paths forward or that it's a valuable decision making tool, they're not going to order it. And payers are certainly not going to reimburse for it. So figuring out where your solution fits in things is really, really valuable. And that's where like open-ended customer discovery calls to find out what people's pain points are can be really, really valuable.
Yeah, thank you.
And then you go into the design thinking or into the systems thinking when you actually know what you're trying to build.
I think the only challenge with healthcare or anything that caters to at a point of patients is that it's a funny industry. The consumers, the payers, the designers, everybody is different. As a patient, I don't have a say in the drugs that are being prepared. The healthcare providers know only so much to treat me, and then payer is going to pay for my disease. So how many stakeholders to sort of satisfy to build a successful product?
Yeah, it's brutal.
All right. I know we have one more person raise their hand, but we'll get to you after. We'll have time